Hello and welcome back to the Armchair Traveler. My name is Judy. I love to travel. I do this on my own, and so can you. I'm here to teach you how. Welcome to Taormina, about an hour or so northeast by bus from Catania in Sicily. I visited here in April 2018. I was only here for one day, but it was sunny, warm, inviting, and charming, and I think of it some days in winter, especially after a huge snowstorm. Taormina is famous mostly for its beach, which is nearly 700 feet below the level of the city, but there is a lot more to see in the city itself. Come and join me for a walk. I took this photo partly so I'd remember how to get back to the bus station. Normally a bus station wouldn't rate a mention, much less a photo in my blog, but I was grateful that the company got me so close to the action without the necessity of my having to climb 700 feet up from sea level along a treacherous switchback road, mostly without a sidewalk, so I decided to give them a shout out. The bus had already gotten me from sea level to Taormina, up about 700 feet or so from the beach, a rather famous religious sanctuary, and the remains of the Taormina Castle are still higher up. The view from close to the bus station gives you some idea of just how steep this cliff is. More climbing was possible, and the view would have been fabulous, but I had hiked partway up Mount Etna the previous day, so I took a pass. The building here is a sanctuary of the Madonna of the Rock. The legend says that a young shepherd got caught up here in a ferocious thunderstorm. The kid hid in the cave with his sheep to wait it out. Naturally, the kid was terrified. I would be too, on the highest point in the area and a good destination for a bolt of lightning. Eventually, he saw a beautiful lady dressed in blue who told him that the storm would end soon. Fortunately for the legend, the storm did end soon. His parents were worried about him, so they ran up to go take a look in the rocks, and they saw him with the sheep who had gathered around him. He told them what had happened and what he had seen in the cave. A lot of people wanted to see the place, and they noticed that on the rock, right where the shepherd saw the lady dressed in blue, there was a figure of the Madonna, which they called the Madonna of the Rock. The local bishop thought this was probably hooey, but he went to see and eventually had a church built here in memory of the story. To the extent that the shepherd claimed that his lady was robed in blue, the statue here seems to match up with legend. Saracen Castle is even higher up that hill than the sanctuary. The real story, like the castle, has been disguised by the mists of time, although it probably was the Acropolis when this was a Greek city. The Romans and later Byzantines must have strengthened the site. In 902 AD, the town fell to the Muslims after a siege of 2 years. They held out remarkably well. The Muslims rebuilt the castle into its present form, adapted to the shape of the rock, and added crenellated walls. The views from here are fabulous. However, it's another 680 steps up and 680 steps down, so I took a pass. This view from Google Earth shows just how high up the sanctuary, 1,400 feet above sea level and at least 700 above the city itself, that castle is. There are a lot of steps. The red arrow points out some of them. This castle might not look like much today, although the outer walls are still there. This Google Earth image shows its commanding location high above the city, as well as the switchback step pathway you have to climb to get to it. It was a formidable defensive location. The Corso Umberto is the main shopping and mostly pedestrianized street here in the city. It's also the longest flat street I encountered during my visit. It stretches about a half a mile between the Messina and Catania gates. All of a day tripper's mandatory stops are within a block or two of it, as well as most of the better restaurants. Taormina draws a lot of tourists, and if the restaurant suggestions from Google are any guide, they're all rich tourists. Almost all the restaurants are rated as expensive or seriously overpriced for what you get. Flowers are on display all over the city. Those red stickered boxes behind and to the left of the flowers are actually mailboxes. This is a theater, not an amphitheater like the Colosseum in Rome. It is the second largest Roman theater, not just in Sicily, but in all of Italy and North Africa. The original construction probably dates to the 3rd century BC. It was built by Greek settlers and included a temple. That temple disappeared when the theater was repaired and enlarged by the Romans in the 2nd century AD. Everything you see here comes from those rebuildings and modifications except the basic structure. It is quite impressive and the views are just spectacular. The theater is still in regular use during the theater season, which sadly I missed. I saw these succulent plants growing along the edges of the Greek theater. Taormina gets quite hot in the summer, and while it never seems to get really cold, the way this former Hoosier thinks of cold, it does cool off somewhat in December and January. Cool is in the eye and skin of the person who is experiencing it. The weather here supports hot weather plants like these succulents. The area behind the seating on the left rises above a very steep hill. The area immediately above those seats was actually part of the outer wall of the facility. Even with much of that wall vanished, the theater appears to be as sound as the day it was opened. You can see here how the theater was set into the hill. This was a view walking up to the main entryway. This theater is still in use during the season, during which the stage would be covered with board. The stage is the area immediately above the heads of the visitors shown in the orchestra area in this photograph. As you can see, the theater still has a great deal of its original back wall, although of course not all of it. Here are some of the remaining decorative elements in the theater. Those aren't teeth in that cornice. The badly weathered part of this was egg and dart pattern. The pattern is still in use in architectural elements to this day. These are remnants of a mosaic floor in the Greek theater. I remember being told that this floor might have been part of the temple or shrine that was located here originally, but which disappeared when the Romans rebuilt the theater. The views from the top of the Greek theater literally took my breath away. It was definitely worth the climb to the top row of steps. I hate heights. Just for this $1 million view of Mount Etna. Enjoy the vistas. This is another theater. The Odeon, or Little Theater, wasn't built by the Greek settlers. The Romans built it here when Taormina became a military colony in the year 21 BC under Caesar Augustus Octavian, the first Roman emperor. The theater was built mostly out of brick, probably on the foundation of an earlier building left behind by the Greeks. The Odeon is actually located behind St. Catherine's Church. It is much smaller, as you can see, than the Greek theater and only seated around 200 or so, compared to the 5,400 that could have been shoved into the Greek theater. Archaeologists believe it was probably covered originally. The theater was built mostly of brick, probably on the foundation from an earlier building left behind by the Greeks. This is St. Catherine of Alexandria's church. St. Catherine is widely venerated in both Catholic and Orthodox churches. The list of people and professions for whom she is a protector is as long as my arm, but first of all is unmarried girls, students, and dying people. That latter affiliation would explain her prominent placement in the St. John's altarpiece in St. John's Hospital in Bruges. Her story goes like this. Catherine was a very young Roman citizen who converted to Christianity and went to visit Emperor Maxentius to show him the light. Maxentius wasn't much interested, but she allegedly converted his wife, Valeria Maximilla, who would have been the stepmother to Constantine the Great. At least here we have some real people. Maxentius tried to force her to give up her faith, and when she refused to give up her faith, he had her beaten and imprisoned. He then offered her her freedom, the story goes, if she were to marry him. Since he was already married, marriage wasn't really what he was offering. She said no. Greatly annoyed, he ordered her to be executed on a breaking wheel. This was a rather hideous instrument of torture in Roman times. When Catherine was taken to the wheel, she touched it, and a miracle occurred. The wheel shattered. Unable to torture her to death, the emperor had her beheaded. This statue of St. Catherine is dated 1493, so it predates the church by nearly 200 years. This is a detail from the base of the statue of St. Catherine. Notice in the center panel that the future saint is shown surrounded by Romans on either side and pictured with her emblem, a wheel. Palazzo Corvaia is a medieval building dating originally from the 10th century when the Arabs conquered the area. It has a cube-shaped tower that they used to defend the town. It is named after one of the oldest and most famous families in Taormina, who owned it from 1538 to 1945. The building remains in use to this day, suitably modernized and repurposed as the local tourist information center. I remember they were quite helpful to me, and I needed their help because I'd left my map and my walking plan back in Catania. There was a Jewish quarter here in Taormina. This was the Palazzo dei Giurati. The legend is that the Jews were brought to Taormina as slaves after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And some likely were, but it seems more likely to me that a lot of them came voluntarily. They were educated people, and educated people, traders in Jerusalem, all spoke Greek. Since much of civilized Sicily also spoke Greek, it seems reasonable that being able to speak the language increased their chances of success. The good times didn't last, however, and today there are few traces of their presence here in the city. I know because I looked. Starting in the 14th century, Sicilian Jews endured open discrimination and in some places were even forced into ghettos. A decree was issued in 1492 ordering their expulsion. By 1493, most of Sicily's Jewish population had left the island, although about 9,000 remained and converted to Christianity. I didn't know what I was looking at when I saw the tiny stars of David in this rather sturdy-looking building, and I couldn't read enough Italian to figure out what it was. In retrospect, this flag should have given it away. It's City Hall. This building dates to the 1700s, not to the original arrival of the Jews. Only the facade is original. At the end of World War II, the city fathers found the buildings in a completely dilapidated state. At that, it must have been still one of the sturdiest buildings in the city. Here you can see the modern security gate and a peek at the rather fancy steps leading upstairs to City Hall. This is one of the few references remaining to the Jewish settlement of Taormina. It's just a street sign. Taormina was a walled city. You saw some evidence of that back at the Saracen castle, but this part of the city was walled as well. What is now a clock tower was originally a gate in that wall. The tower was built in the 12th century but was demolished by the French in 1676 and then rebuilt eventually as a clock. This is a good-sized square, although not nearly as attractive as the Piazza of April 9th. It does house the cathedral and a really nice fountain. I saw a lot of people here resting and trying to cool off in that water. This is a close-up of the Minotaur that tops the fountain, which was built in 1635. It's a Baroque beauty made of marble. It sits just outside the cathedral and is also called the Four Fountains because there are four small columns supporting these basins. The fountain is topped by a Minotaur, half human and half horse, which is the emblem of the city of Taormina. It's shown here as a female. It has a crown and holds an orb and scepter, symbols of power, in its hands. This pony was one of the other beasts here in the fountain. The cathedral was the last major site on my itinerary, and to be honest, I wasn't as impressed as I should have been. I must admit it doesn't look like a lot from the outside, just a gray stone building that looked more like a fortress than a church. I found out that the oldest part dates to the 13th century. They built it on the ruins of a church that had been dedicated to St. Nicholas of Bari. It was rebuilt in the 15th, 16th, and 18th centuries. The wood ceiling of the cathedral struck me as dangerously flammable. I couldn't tell from my vantage point whether there was a fire suppression system in place or not. I certainly hope there is. This is one of the treasures of the cathedral, a Byzantine-era Madonna and Child. The icon is covered with embossed silver and enhanced with colored glass, or possibly gemstones, and what should be gold bracelets on both the Madonna and the Child's arms. I've seen many other Byzantine-style icons and even more from Russia, so I know that silver embossing is fairly common. Initially, the entire icon was painted first, and the silver was added to protect everything except the hands and face. My somewhat cynical Russian culture professor told me that later on, the only thing that was actually painted was the hands and face. In this case, you can still see the remnants of the paint for those parts of the body. This terracotta Last Supper was quite interesting. The few sources I could find suggest that the artist was named Turo Azzolino, and it dates from 2014. I remember hearing that it was somewhat controversial. The Bible tells us the names of the apostles, but as far as I know, there's no rule for seating order at the Last Supper table, although many do seem to follow the precedent set by Leonardo da Vinci. Taking Leonardo as my guide, the group on the left, looking surprised or perhaps frightened, are Bartholomew, James, the son of Alphaeus, and Andrew. The next three, starting with the man with the immense beard, are Judas Iscariot, Peter, and John. I've read that some people try to interpret that ladder-seated figure as Mary Magdalene on account of the long flowing hair, but if you look at the other figures, many have long locks, although I have to admit not nearly so wavy and luxurious as this one. The character was probably meant to appear androgynous, leaving room for interpretation. In the center is Jesus with his cup. When I travel, if I decide to eat out, it's generally lunch, not supper, and Taormina was no exception. I had a nice restaurant all picked out for lunch. It sounded like it would have a lot of fish. It was very highly rated on Google, and I went past it 3 times. It would have been excellent. I think I mentioned that Taormina is built into a hill, so to get off the Corso you either have to climb up or climb down. Later on I found another restaurant, this time downhill, and there were some very narrow steps. The food was acceptable, the setting was pleasant, but it wasn't anything really special. Thank you for joining me on this visit to sunny Taormina. This is the Messina Gate, which leads back to the bus station. Fortunately for me, the trail was downhill this time. Thank you for joining me today. If you think this video is interesting or helpful, please give it a like, share, and subscribe to my channel. It's free to you, but it will help the channel grow. Travel sites and history can be fairly wordy, especially background information, so some of my YouTube video blogs will have companion pieces with more information. There are also pieces which don't make it into video format at all. You can read them on my WordPress blog site. The address is armchairtraveler2022.wordpress.com. If you'd like to keep up when I post new blogs or video blogs, or are interested in short posts, follow me on Twitter, where my handle is @armchair2022. I'll be tweeting updates for new posts, and when I begin traveling again, we'll take you along virtually on Twitter.